Hello and welcome to Unit 10, Personality Part 1. In this unit we're going to be looking at personality, who we are and why we are the way we are. So a little bit of a unit overview where we're going to be going with it. Again, we're doing this at the end of the year, so hopefully a lot of this should be review. We're going to be looking at personality from a psychoanalytical perspective, so why Freud thinks we are the way we are, from a humanistic perspective, a trait perspective, social cognitive, and then a little bit on exploring the self. So we'll do some things that you probably, if you've taken social psych, have looked at your personality and types. But in these notes, today's notes, we're just going to be focusing on Freud, the psychoanalytical point of view. So let's start our unit by talking about what personality is. When we say someone has a positive personality or a negative personality, what does that mean? So personality, and for psychology, we define it as a pattern of characteristics and thinking, acting, and feeling. So we're looking for that keyword being pattern, right? We're not talking about ways they act once or twice, but it has to be distinct and enduring. So patterns that are enduring, meaning that they last over time. We'll talk about at the end of our notes whether or not personality can change over our life, but pretty much we run under the assumption that personality lasts our entire lives, right? We have a type of personality that comes with us. So the classic theories that we'll start talking about first are Freudian, psychoanalytical, and humanistic. And these notes will just be doing Freud's psychoanalytical point of view because there's a lot of vocabulary that goes along with this and a lot of concepts that Freud talked about. Okay, so this note, psychoanalytical perspective, why or how we became the people we are personality-wise. Okay, so let's, some of this is review, so I'm going to kind of go over them right and type in the definition again. So remember that Freud, even though all of his ideas seemed kind of crazy to us, he is like the bobblehead of psychology. He did a lot for Western psychology. If you ask any person on the street to name a famous psychologist, most often they'll say Sigmund Freud. Remember that he practiced the what are they called? Methods of free association. So he, in the beginning, actually tried hypnosis, but for his patients, he found it was more beneficial, or he got more out of the free association, which is lying on the couch and just having them talk about whatever they want to talk about. Free association, like free talk. And that he used methods called psychoanalysis, looking at past things that had happened that somehow affect the future, and unconscious drives. So in this slide and the next couple ones, we're going to be comparing the unconscious. There's a new vocabulary right here, the conscious, the unconscious, and then the pre-conscious we haven't talked about before. So remember that the conscious, and this is a good analogy here, the conscious are those things that are in our mind that we're able to explicitly state, the things that we are aware of, our feelings that we are aware of, our thoughts that we are aware of. And the unconscious then is going to be below the surface. This is going to be those thoughts, wishes, and feelings and memories that we are not aware of, right? They're somewhere in our mind, the feelings, the thoughts we have, but we are not able to explain them because they are in our unconscious mind. And then the pre-conscious is this place right in between the two. It's where they're stored. Those unconscious thoughts are stored for just a short period of time. And that they could be accessible from our preconscious. So you're dreaming, right? So remember Freud looked at dreams a lot. Went from like the unconscious, all these things that happen. That preconscious is those things that the outside awareness that we have of them, but we're not able to access them. Okay, so it's right on the edge there. And remember that repression, when we repress things into our unconscious, they're things that we were aware of, but we repress or push them into our unconscious so that they're not on the surface anymore. Okay, so this is going to make more sense when we talk about our next slide, which is going to again use your iceberg analogy, talking about the personality structures of Freud. So Freud thought that the personality structure could be broken into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. Okay, and these three structures were really going, or were progressive, meaning that they started when you were a child and they progressed as you get older. And it really is fighting the battle between our impulses and restraint. That at each one of these stages, we are battling with ourselves for the things that we want to do and the things that we know we shouldn't. Okay, so these go in order. So we're going to progress down. So the first personality structure that you would maybe classify as an infant, right? So infant to like 2, 3 years old is the id. And the id part of our personality is the pleasure-seeking part of our personality. This is the part, like, so a baby would cry if it wants attention, no matter who's surrounding, or if you're in a store or in a movie. It is the now versus later type of philosophy that you live for the moment, you are seeking things to make you happy, that give you pleasure, that make you happy without any consequences of what happened afterwards. Okay, so a baby or a toddler in the id stage is kind of a self-centered. Now, when we talk about our id personality later in life, this would be someone who's self-centered, who lives for the moment, that really is just seeking out things to make them happy. Now, as we progress, so as we go from the id personality structure to the ego personality structure, this is our reality principle. So it wants to gratify the id's pleasures in a realistic way. So this is where impulse versus restraint meet. Here are my impulses, but I also know that there's restraints in ways that we need to act, or I need to act in society that's good for myself. Those where those two meet. So progressively it goes id and then ego. And then the super ego is like the last stage of development, kind of like the top moral. And these are what you, like your conscience. Okay, so not being conscious of something, but like your conscience, like your Jiminy Cricket, like on your shoulder, angel devil type of thing. And your moral compass. It wants to seek out the things that are real, but also the things that are ideal. So it kind of is the thing that dreams, right, but also keeps it real and ideal. Okay, so going back to the iceberg personality, or no, sorry, iceberg analogy of personality. So my ego then, the conscious mind, would be at the top. So the conscious mind is my ego. It's the executive mediator. It's the thing that decides the reality. How am I going to do what I want to do, what my id wants to do, but keep it realistic so that I'm living in the now. Okay? The super ego is kind of a little bit below. It's in the unconscious. These are my internalized ideals, right? My moral compass, the kind of thing that keeps me where I need to be. And my id is all this unconscious psychic energy that lies beneath, that drives my personality and my behavior, right? My pleasure-seeking principle. And a lot of the id is in my unconscious, all right? Because there are things that I might not be aware of that I want to do, but my ego and my super ego are in charge of making sure that you're realistic about it. Okay? Now Freud, so this is how he said our personality is structured. Now there's things progressively through your life that can change the structure of your personality. And I mentioned these once in notes already, but Freud outlined something called the psychosexual stages, how my personality develops over time. So the psychosexual stages is going back to the id, focusing on pleasure seeking, and he decided his ideas were that a person will go from stage to stage and deal with this conflict of pleasure and restraint in different order. So this goes in order from youngest to oldest, and I'm going to give you a chart next to copy down. So psychosexual stages focus on the pleasure zones, or erogenous zones they're called, and in order it went from oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. So I'm going to have you copy down this chart here. You might want to pause it, so stop. I'm going to explain some of the things too, but if you want to pause now and copy it down and then send later. So the oral stage is 1.5 years to birth, and the focus there is anything with the mouth, right? So sucking, biting, chewing. They focus on this stage, right, until they get it down where they can go in between the id and then the ego, right? So the pleasure and then the restraint. Younger kids like to bite people until they realize that biting is not okay. They like to suck on things, right, which is good, bottles, nipples, so that they get food. But if you've ever been around younger kids, they'll actually put anything into their mouth and kind of play with it until they realize that that's not okay. So once they've mastered that stage, they move on to the anal stage, which goes from 3 years to 1.5 years, right? So 1.5 years to 3. And this is the potty training stage. So the anal pleasure's on anything. The pleasure focuses on bowel, being able to control. So this is a control stage. Being able to control your bowel and bladder movements and coping with the demands of control. So that be considered the anal stage. So I've mastered that the oral stage, right? So I can control myself there. Now I can control bladder and bowel movements. That's the anal stage. The next stage goes from 3 to 6 years. It's the phallic stage. This is where the pleasure zone moves to the genitals. And coping with incestuous feelings. We'll talk about complexes in the next slide. But this is where a child has to go in between where it's appropriate, right, for pleasure and where it's appropriate for restraint. Latency is 6 to puberty. This is where the sexual feelings are dormant, meaning that they're not on the surface. And then from puberty on, it's all in the genital stage. And this is the maturation of sexual interest. And he didn't go any further than that. Okay, now let's talk about this one right here, the phallic stage, the complexes that exist. So there's two main complexes you'll need to know about, which are Oedipus and Electra. And what Freud said is that if you get stuck in this stage for too long, we'll talk about fixation, that some type of complex may occur. So the Oedipus complex, if you know anything about Greek mythology, Oedipus was a baby that was taken away from his family, and somehow, it's a really long story, but somehow became king, and then he went back and killed his dad and married his mother. He didn't know it was his mother. He didn't know it was his dad. But the Oedipus complex, what Freud named it for that, is that when boys go through that genital stage, they tend to have jealous feelings of their father and are sexually attracted to their mother. And this is a very normal feeling, but you get over it, right? There's that restraint where they realize that that's not okay. Now, if you don't get over that stage, it's called Oedipus complex, where attraction to your mother, hatred of your father. The opposite of that is Electra, again in Greek mythology. So girls' attraction to their father and hatred of their mother. Now, when moving through the personality development, Freud said that this is where you tend to get your identity, your gender identity. What's right, what's not right, and this is identification is the term that he coined as when you can start combining your parents' values into your developing superego. That's where you create your identification, so the combination of the two. Now talking about being fixated, so fixated is going back to any of these stages here. I'll go right here. So if you become fixated in any of these stages, oral, anal, phallic, it means like you didn't completely get through the stage and you, like for instance, you were taken off the bottle too early, so you never mastered the oral stage. So you have a strong conflict with that stage still that might go into your later life. So for instance, if you still have an oral complex, people that said have an oral complex like bite their nails a lot, they smoke, they have gum, like they need to be constantly interacting with their mouth. Okay, so that fixation is when, for some reason, you don't come through that stage successfully, mastering that restraint, and it haunts you the rest of your life. Okay, in class, we're going to talk about defense mechanisms. So Freud outlines these. These are all vocab terms, so there's a lot of important things you need to know. He outlines these 9 defense mechanisms that you need to know. So if you just want to write these down and leave some room, so repression, regression, reaction, projection, displacement, subliminal denial, and rationalization we'll talk about in class, but leave some room at the end of your notes and we'll fill those in. Okay, that's the end of our psychoanalysis and Freud stages. A lot of vocab heavily tested on that portion of the AP test. All right, have a great night, and I will talk to you later.